כאילו אינסופית, היינו בה כבר, ויש מלא מקומות שלא ראינו כאן. כל זה, הקרניים שלו זזות, הראש זז. And sadness long gone. I know you'll be there, love, still waiting for me, someday when my life is all done. And what could be better than this at the end? Your smile and the sit in the sun. This presentation is about the link between Christian confession and modern psychoanalytic practices, and especially about the fundamental difference between ancient and modern confessional practices, their goals and their therapeutic effects. So I'll start with Freud and then plunge into the far past. Freud and Breuer noticed in their early studies of hysteria that having Freud and Breuer noticed in their studies of hysteria that having confessed traumatic incidents during hypnosis, their patients went through a catharsis, or what Freud called an abreaction, that alleviated their symptoms. Freud and Breuer explained that the very act of confessing and having the confession interpreted or analyzed led to the patients being cured of various psychological and physiological ailments. Freud would later develop a more nuanced view and reject the notion of confession as catharsis or abreaction. Nevertheless, it is his early and immature psychoanalytic notion of talking cure which has remained influential to this day. Now, to attribute a universally cathartic effect to confession is to assume that the function of confessional practices would have been the same for early Christians as they are today. While a historical link can indeed be traced between Christian confession and modern psychoanalytic practices, it was a slow relay
race that passed through different disciplines. Nor is Christian confession simply a response to an innate psychological need, but rather the invention of something new. This view is supported by a growing literature on the emergence of a new interest in interiority in late antiquity. The claim that a new emphasis on the inner life of the individual emerged in this period has been elaborated by Michel Foucault, who recognized in the monastic practices of confession the appearance of a new kind of self, or a new kind of relationship to ourselves. Although an emphasis on interiority appears to have been a crucial aspect of the religious transformations in late antiquity, the status of interiority in Christianity was, of course, highly ambiguous. Christianity emphasized human inwardness only to radically doubt the integrity of the inner man. In other words, the very imperative to scrutinize every hidden aspect of the soul led to the recognition of the self's utter sinfulness. In this paper, I want to illustrate the radical difference between early monastic and modern confessions, their therapeutic effects, and their underlying notions of selfhood, by focusing on a confessional procedure that the early Greek fathers called exagorosis, self-disclosure, which Michel Foucault appraised as a distinctively early Christian contribution to the history of self-technologies. This confessional variant of self-technologies developed within the context of monastic life, especially within the Eastern monastic tradition, which is at the focus of this paper. Monks were expected to verbalize all their thoughts for the discernment of the Father in order that they might be examined. According to the anonymous collection of the sayings of the Desert Fathers, our fathers had the custom of visiting the cells of those brothers at the beginning of their career who wished to practice their discipline in solitude. They would examine them in case any of them, tempted by demons, was damaged in his thoughts, logismos. This form of self-examination, unlike the public ritual known as examologesis, could not merely be manifested performatively, but needed to be put into words. These words have been preserved in early monastic correspondences, collections of questions and answers, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and other writings of spiritual guidance originating in Egypt, Gaza, and Sinai. In the following, I examine the patterns of communication employed by Greek-speaking monks in verbalizing their thoughts for the discernment of an elder in order to reconstruct how self-disclosure actually worked. To do so, I propose to examine the language employed by monks in verbalizing their thoughts, namely the ways in which the state or activity of thinking was semanticized or acted out in language. As this implies, I'm not interested in what was said in the interaction between monastic elders and their disciples, but in how it was said. Rather than stressing the referential function of language, I look at the language itself and specifically the grammar, which has the power to convey meanings that are more subtle than those conveyed by plain statements. I would like to suggest that the unique linguistic interpretation of thinking employed by late antique monks in verbalizing their thoughts was not simply a convenient or expressive way to talk about mental processes, but a way of bringing about a shift in the understanding of the self as distinct from one's thoughts.
יש פה טעות. באמת? זה ממש קטן אז. זה לא מאוד משכנע. באמת?